One of the most important questions in the pandemic was whether or not people who already had moderate to severe COVID, say for instance in 2020, and were then vaccinated, what were the outcomes? This is such a fundamental question. And what I'll be doing today is I'll be taking you through a paper that was here from 2022 about post and acute sequelae associated with SARS-CoV-2 reinfection and highlighting a really critical piece of information that wasn't highlighted. And it's only on reflection that I've seen this information jump out at me. Now, before we start, I think that you will be able to understand if you join me at this upcoming event, COVID Heartstorm, Uncover the Secret Scars on the Heart. This is coming up within about a week. If you're interested, click on the link in the description and join us, because I think that this is going to be one of the most important explanations as to why this data that I'm talking about is critical. So let's start with the basic question. And you have to understand where I'm coming from first. Anyone who has been following me will recognize that I have always been talking about autoimmunity and autoimmune responses. This is where my research has been since 2020. And the basic premise of my research has always shown something like this. And effectively, all I was saying is that if you had free floating ACE2, which is the entry receptor for the virus, if it's in the bloodstream, when the virus is in the bloodstream, good chance that they would bind together. And then when the immune system digests this whole thing, it will make antibodies not just to the virus and the spike protein, but also to ACE2. And that will then cause damage to different parts of the body. It's primarily the lungs, the heart, the kidneys, the brain, where ACE2 is located. To me, this is basic science stuff. This is simple extrapolation of the science and essentially been what I've been saying from 2020. So within that paradigm, and you don't have to agree with autoimmunity to understand what I'm asking. Let's put aside autoimmunity for a moment. Let's just acknowledge that the cytokine storm that occurred that killed people was immune dysregulation. The immune system went into overdrive, not underdrive. It wasn't the virus that killed people. It was the immune system in overdrive that killed people. That's the cytokine storm. Okay? Once you understand that, then the next logical question is, if the immune system in overdrive was the primary driver of mortality, should you further stimulate the immune system with vaccines after someone has had severe disease? So I'm not talking about the COVID naive population at the moment. I'm not necessarily saying that they shouldn't have vaccinated the population in case censors are listening. That's not what I'm saying. I am talking about people who already had moderate to severe COVID-19 with a hyperactive, dysregulated immune system leading to microclots and inflammation in the lungs, the heart, the kidneys, the brain. Should those cohorts who would have already had natural immunity then be vaccinated? Now, you have to understand that if you understand how COVID works, part of the problem is to do with the interferon system is being late. And that's because in some people have interferon autoantibodies. So if they had it in the first place, this could potentially affect them again in terms of reinfections. And this is technically what the paper was looking at. So let's come to the paper now. So this paper was in Nature, is in Nature, and is one of the most important papers that was published. And they were looking at the outcomes after a COVID reinfection. So these are people who already had an infection confirmed and they were infected again. What were the outcomes? Very good question. And you can see it was accepted in September of 22, published in November of 22. Huge paper. I remember looking at this before, but I hadn't missed the point I'm going to tell you. And they were looking at a cohort. Literally, the non-infected control was 5 million veterans. So this is Veterans National Healthcare Database in the US. So it gives you an idea as the age range. These are older people, primarily males. And then you have one COVID infection, two or more infections, and the non-infected control. The critical takeaway in the abstract, and this is where I say that, and this is an important point, there is a difference between what is true and what is the truth. And you can sometimes get away with highlighting something that is true, but not highlighting the truth. And that's my call, that's my challenge to the authors in this, because what they said here is that the risks of reinfection were evident regardless of vaccination status. Whether somebody was vaccinated or unvaccinated, the risks were evident. This is true, but not the truth. So I'll explain to you why I say that now. So before I get into why I say that, they did a breakdown looking at all factors in terms of outcomes. They looked at the all-cause mortality, hospitalization, heart problems, diabetes, gastrointestinal, kidney issues, all of these things they looked at with regards to reinfection. And what you can see, this line here represents the baseline. Anything beyond this line to the right suggests increased risk. So all throughout most organ systems, there is increased risk with reinfection. So this is very important to acknowledge. And this is why I warn people, don't underestimate what is going on with regards to circulating variants. The other thing that they highlighted, which was again very important, is to do with the outcomes over time. So this is looking at over a 6-month period. And you can see in all-cause mortality, it was highest in the first month and gradually falls off, but it is still above baseline, even at the 6-month period, the acute phase versus the post-acute phase. This is just with a reinfection. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were in hospital. They just had a reinfection. And so this is a critical piece of information to highlight that ongoing infection with the virus causes long-term issues. Good. This is great information. But here's the problem. When you look at the discussion with regards to what's going on, they talk about different issues. They talk about the potential confoundings in the data set. They talk about the age range. And then they highlight down here in summary, in the study of almost 5.8 million individuals, we provide evidence that reinfection contributes to additional health risks beyond those incurred in the first infection, including all-cause mortality, hospitalization, and sequelae in a broad array of organ systems. That is true, but in my view, that is not the truth. Because there is something else in this paper that when I looked back at it, I thought, oh my goodness, this is the piece of information that we actually really needed to know. And this was from 2022. And what they found here was that they looked at the breakdown in all-cause mortality based on vaccination status. No vaccine, one vaccination, two or more vaccinations. And what they're saying here, with this line here, this represents almost what you would expect if there was no increased risk. If anything to the right is indicating increased risk. And so what they're saying is that if you were unvaccinated and reinfected, you had a higher mortality, all cause mortality. You had a higher risk of hospitalization. And this was independent of vaccination status, whether you are unvaccinated, one vaccination, or two vaccinations, two or more vaccinations. That is true, but not the truth. So here is the bit that is really critical. And I had to break this out for you to be able to see it. Because in my view, this was the important piece of information that should have been said in the paper. When we look at all cause mortality between the unvaccinated, the single vaccine, the two or more vaccinations, after reinfection, this is what it looks like. And I put them together so you can see. At the top here is the unvaccinated. And you can see, in terms of all cause mortality, they still have a higher risk of mortality after infection, but they have a lower risk compared to one and two or more vaccinations. This is absolutely critical information to understand. Why in the world would reinfection cause higher mortality in people who had been vaccinated? And what's interesting is when you look at hospitalization, very slight difference, meaning that it is still slightly favoring the unvaccinated, but it's not particularly significant. But all cause mortality here, what this indicates is that the people who are dying after reinfection are not getting into hospital. And that would therefore suggest sudden, unexpected deaths. Isn't this what we've been saying for years? How many people are dying unexpectedly? How many people have had big heart attacks or massive clots on the lung? These are the things that cause people to die and not get into hospital. Because if they were dying in hospital, you would expect that this would look the same. It would be about a similar match. But when you look, there is only a slight difference in terms of the unvaccinated. But all cause mortality, this to me should not have been left out in the paper. They should have highlighted this. This was in 2022. And it should have raised the flag that there could be potentially higher risk for those people who already had infection, moderate, say, to severe COVID, and are then further immune stimulated. For me, it never made any logical scientific sense. It's kind of like if you had a child who just had measles, would you then go vaccinate them? That doesn't make any sense. They already had measles. You're glad they didn't have any complications, but why would you then give them a measles vaccine? That was the question, and especially because immune dysregulation was the primary mechanism of severe disease. There is a difference between what is true and what is the truth. This was in November of 2022. This was at about the time where they may have reached maybe the fourth booster dose. This kind of information should have been thoroughly investigated to understand who could benefit and who was most at risk. That's now the question that needs to be answered. Is it possible that for people who already had moderate to severe COVID-19 in the early phase, that they could be harmed by ongoing immune stimulation? That's really the question. And what does it mean going forward? Because in this cohort who are older, they are also the ones who are being recommended now for boosters. Have they looked carefully at the data? Have they considered the implications? Do they understand the principle of the cytokine storm? This is where the science is essential. Too many people are happy to recommend stuff without understanding the science. If you understand the science, it would help you to be more cautious, more nuanced, more wise when you think of the forward plan with regards to what you do and what is likely to bring the most benefit. This is important information, and the final point that I will make is this. If this had been highlighted in November of 2022, it would have been easier to ensure that autopsies were being done on the vaccinated cohort who got reinfected to see whether or not the pathology was the same as before in the pandemic, to understand what could be happening with the further immune stimulation. Why was and is still today, because of the autopsies are still not being done, why was this allowed to go under the radar? These are the questions that need to be asked, and I know to do it because lives are at risk. And if there is harm, we need to figure out how we can mitigate it. Remember, join us with regards to the COVID heart storm. This is important because this mechanism is probably likely to explain why so many people don't end up in hospital, but the all-cause mortality is higher, because the suddenness would explain that difference between hospitalization and mortality. That's my thought on it. We still have a long way to go, but at least the data can be extracted if we look hard enough. But it's a shame that we have to go searching this out rather than it being clearly declared and made understood and shared with the public. Have a good evening.